Rent can be a beautiful thing. You pay some money and you get a place to live, fulfilling a basic human need for safety and shelter. And depending on how much you're able or willing to spend, that place can be bigger or smaller. In this neighborhood or that one, it can even be chill with your dog hanging out. When rent thrives, renters can find their special spot, and they can do it without spreading themselves too thin on the rest of their monthly budget. But what happens when the beauty of rent withers? When that price we pay for that fundamental need becomes less and less reasonable?
In Nova Scotia, rent has withered, and rent control has been proposed as one solution to curb the growing unaffordability. And on the surface, it seems like the obvious response to the problem. Just mandate rents at an affordable rate and problem solved.
But it seems it's not quite that simple. While some see rent control as the antidote to rental unaffordability, others believe that rent control can do more harm than good, that renters would actually be better off without it. But how can that be?
The question we'll be asking in this video is not, can lower rents help renters? We feel pretty confident that they can. Rather, we're asking, can rent even be controlled? Before we get into rent control, let's first take a look at what rent actually is and why it changes.
Rent is the sum of money that a renter agrees to pay a landlord in exchange for housing, and typically, both parties sign a contract to lock in that exchange at agreed upon price. Ideally, one that is reasonable and consistent with local income opportunities. In practice though, a renter typically doesn't have the power to negotiate price for a rental. Typically, a landlord will list their rental at a set price, and the renter's ability to negotiate price really only amounts to their ability to compare different options on the rental market. Renters negotiate with the market, not with individual landlords.
There's a belief in Canada that the market, through the forces of supply and demand, will set rents at a price that can be reasonably attained by local incomes. And the rationale here is that if rents weren't fair, people would stop paying them and landlords would have to reduce their prices in order to fill their vacancies.
But there's a unique quality to rent and housing that challenges this rationale. Unlike other goods, like owning a car for example, people don't have the option not to have housing. Sure, in theory they might be able to move to a less expensive neighborhood or to a smaller home, but life isn't always that simple. The population of Halifax is experiencing rapid growth, and demand for rental housing is outpacing supply. This has allowed landlords to set higher and higher prices and still find willing renters. But the fact that people are renting housing at high prices should not be construed as evidence that prices are reasonably in line with local incomes. But it wouldn't be fair to say that rents only increase because landlords feel that the market owes them more money. Many landlords operate on razor-thin margins, earning just enough income from their rental to cover the cost of owning it. And as their costs grow, they are forced to increase their rents.
In Halifax, a portion of growing rent prices can be attributed to low supply on the market, which has allowed landlords to increase rents and still find their tenants. But that's not the whole story. These growing rent prices can also be attributed to the growing cost of being a landlord. Later in this video, we'll see how these costs can make implementing rent control tricky.
So, if rent is getting more expensive for both the landlord and the renter, who's actually benefiting? It's hard to say. A certain amount of rent increase is natural and should be expected due to inflation, but it seems to be that rents are rising faster than inflation. Perhaps we can say that the housing market experiences inflation in a different way than local incomes do. And this mismatch is an indication that the market on its own is imperfect in its ability to offer housing at affordable prices. Now for the feature presentation. Let's talk about rent control. Rent controls are government-enforced regulations that specify how and when rents can be increased. Rent controls can take many forms, but they generally have two goals: to limit rapid rent increases and to maintain existing affordable housing. Rent control programs arose in Europe and North America in response to the housing shortages caused by World War I and World War II. Since then, programs have evolved, and today, most cities have at least some kind of rent control in place. In Nova Scotia, rent control is typically enacted through the province, not the municipalities. And here, we already have rent control that limits landlords to only increasing rent once in a 12-month period. And with that, they must give 4 months' notice. But until recently, we had no limit on how much that rent could increase by. This changed over the course of the COVID-19 pandemic, when the province capped rent increases province-wide at 2% per year. This cap will remain in place until February 1st, 2022, or whenever the COVID-19 state of emergency is lifted. At this point, we don't know if this is the spawning of a long-term solution or just a short-term crisis band-aid.
When the government sets a percentage at which rents can increase, like we've done in Nova Scotia, this is called a rental cap, and it's just one kind of rent control. This control meets the goal of limiting rapid rent increases, but it doesn't maintain existing affordable housing, because limiting the growth of something that's already unaffordable can stop the bleeding, but it won't heal the wound.
To meet that second goal of maintaining existing affordable housing, another form of rent control called a price ceiling or a price freeze sets rents at a particular price deemed locally affordable. It's a more absolute measure compared to price caps, which are relative to what the rent already was. Remember Monica and Rachel's unbelievably spacious apartment in Friends? Well, that spaciousness was so unbelievable that the show's writers felt that they actually had to explain it, and they drew on a real rent control program in New York City to do so. This program prohibited landlords from raising rents to market value as long as a tenant maintained their original lease. The tenant, however, must have signed the lease before 1971. And in the show, Monica explains that she inherited the lease from her grandmother, so it checks out.
And I don't know about you, but I grew up watching that apartment and thinking, renting is gonna be friggin' awesome.
Sadly, the rent control depicted in Friends is more than a hair unrealistic. Even with the rent control program, Monica and Rachel still lived far beyond their means. Though the imagery of that apartment may be misleading, it does raise some interesting questions about what rent control is capable of, particularly how far should rent control policies go. For the extreme end of rent control, let's look at Sweden. Its capital, Stockholm, is experiencing housing pressures as a result of a national rent control policy. And before I begin, we'll acknowledge that Stockholm and Halifax are very different places that can't be directly compared. Sweden designed its rent control to ensure that anyone who doesn't own their own property has access to an affordable home. To do this, Sweden adopted a unique policy that has been instrumental in keeping rents low. This method is called utility value, which appraises the value of a rental based on characteristics like its size, design, and location, and not based on what the highest bidder would pay to rent it, as the free market would encourage. In addition, they added price caps to align the inflation of rent with broader economic inflation.
So, has this program helped Swedish renters?
About 20% of households across Sweden and closer to 40% in Stockholm rent rent-controlled apartments. For those lucky enough to have a first-hand public rent contract in Stockholm, rents can be very reasonable, maybe even what we'd call inexpensive. Because of the utility value system, a rent-controlled apartment in Stockholm would rent, on average, for about $940 for a 700 square foot apartment. Try finding that in Halifax. Over the past decade, Stockholm rents have risen by 19%, not far ahead of inflation, which was about 12%, and last year's rent rise for the city was 1.12%. In theory, this could be considered a success. Close to 40% of households in Stockholm are rent-controlled and more affordable than they would be under market conditions.
And that brings us to the tricky thing about rent control, the theory. Because in theory, rent control should, on average, make rents cheaper than they would be otherwise. But is that actually what ends up happening? To answer that, let's first circle back to our two primary goals of rent control, which we said were to limit rapid rent increases and to maintain existing affordable housing.
These goals intend on shielding renters from economic shocks that can make rents unreasonable in comparison to local incomes. But by creating a shield for a fraction of renters, rent control can create unintended outcomes for the rest of the rental market outside of that shield. Studies have shown that rent control can create scarcity in the rental market, which makes it more difficult for those people outside of that rent control shield to get housing. And when they do, rents may be more expensive for them. There are a few reasons why this happens. The first is that rent control alters the financial incentives of housing developers. Rent controls place limitations on the amount that developers can charge and therefore how much profit can be made. It's enough to make some new rental housing developments unprofitable, and for the projects that could still turn a profit, they become less attractive in comparison to other kinds of investments. For example, rent control policies can make it more appealing for developers to build condominiums instead of rental units. Another important factor that can lead to rental scarcity is that people tend to not move out of rent-controlled apartments, and I can't really blame them. Often, these apartments are such a good deal in comparison to the private market that people never leave, even when the place is no longer appropriate for their needs. On top of this, rent control can also lead to smaller apartments through the subdivision of larger units, which allows landlords to collect rent from more tenants. It may also incentivize landlords to subdivide units instead of renovating existing units to higher standards. Some economists say that Sweden's rent control system has made developers there reluctant to construct new housing, thus contributing towards a rental housing shortage, which is hardest on those renters unable to get a rent-controlled contract. This is exactly what has happened in Stockholm. For those lucky renters with a first-hand rent-controlled apartment, life is good. But for the many without one, they face a housing market that is unhinged and ruthless. Demand is so high for these rent-controlled apartments that nearly half of all Stockholmers, about 500,000 people, are on the wait list. And it takes a good 9 years to be granted a rent-controlled apartment. Because of the wait list, a black market for sublets of rent-controlled apartments has emerged, where sublet apartments, though cheaper than the private market, can still cost more than their rent-controlled price. In these cases, just because an apartment is rent-controlled, it doesn't mean that the person living there is actually paying the rent-controlled price. Rent control is tricky because even when it's successful, it still leads to new challenges like wait lists, scarcity, bedroom misallocation, and deteriorating quality, all of which may make it more difficult and more expensive for renters outside the rent control shield.
And that brings us back to our initial question. Can rent even be controlled? Well, the answer hinges greatly on what we mean by control. Because in certain respects, we absolutely can control rent. We've already done that in Nova Scotia with the 2% rent cap, although we still don't know if this is a permanent solution or just a temporary fix. Yet, rent is still a challenge in Nova Scotia. We controlled its rapid rise, but did we really control it to the point of affordability? And in this moment, renters in Nova Scotia are probably scratching their heads and thinking, hey, I recognize those potential negative outcomes of rent control like scarcity, deteriorating conditions, or rent evictions. We already have those under a free market system. Maybe the lesson is that there will always be challenges in something as complex as the housing market, and that just because rent control can lead to challenges, that shouldn't automatically dismiss its positive possibilities.
If we're going to seriously consider rent control in Nova Scotia, we have to first establish our goals for the rental housing market. Are they to stop the bleeding of runaway rent growth, like we've seen with the 2% rent cap? Or should our goal be to bring rents, on a whole, more in line with local income opportunities? Rent control isn't going to be a magic, fix-all solution to our housing problems. It's only a single tool in the policy toolbox. It needs to work alongside vacancy taxes, affordable development incentives, higher density zoning, support programs for low-income households, and government-funded nonprofit housing. If rent control is going to work, it needs to be done in a way that still incentivizes private industry to invest in rental housing. And we're hearing landlords and tenants alike complain of the rising cost of rental housing. If our current setup isn't working for either of these groups, maybe, just maybe, that's a signal that the market isn't working like we hoped it might.
Even though rent control may seem radical, and it can be, the idea is actually pretty normal. We regulate other markets all the time to protect consumers, the environment, our health. So why not the rental market as well? Maybe the question about rent shouldn't be, can it be controlled? Again, we've seen that there are ways that it can be. Maybe the question should be, what do we value when it comes to housing? Do we value housing as a financial asset that can be measured and traded? Or do we value the less tangible view of housing as someone's home, as someone's shelter, as someone's basic human right? We think we can do both, to make rent that beautiful thing where both sides have a seat at the table.